co-founders of Impact Hub Oakland, and I'm the director of this gallery. I'm also the chief creative officer, and so in the question that we asked our community, would make shoe come alive, this is actually the part that makes me come alive. And one of the reasons why I decided to stay a part of the team, to really bring into the conversation the process of arts dialogue, artivism, arts activism, and art making as a tool for creative social justice and for social entrepreneurship. And so Omi means water. It's also a title, Japanese title, which means head of state, or it's like someone with high ranking in the community. And so in the conversation around Impact Hub Oakland and our business model, and as a space that is really activated and framed in principles of permaculture, we wanted to have a conversation that included all of the elements and the places where systems come together. And so if you have the opportunity to take some time to walk around the room, you'll see that a lot of the woodwork and a lot of the space is really framed in beauty, and the stage and the wall are an art piece made from the roof of this building. Actually, that these tables in this room were also made from the roof of this building. We actually had to take the roof off. And so being the kind of urban greenies that we are, we wanted to make sure to repurpose that wood. And we wanted to make sure that there was a group of artists, different groups of artists who actually had the opportunity to put their hands, their thoughts, their ideas into being an integral part of this space. And our opportunity to sit and hold court with social justice activists such as Favianna Rodriguez tonight, it's really our pleasure to be able to have had her art here from the beginning. So we opened on February 3rd. The 6th day we held a hackathon with Startup Weekend and Black Male Achievement with 400 or so people in the building, and so it's just kind of been gangbusters since then. Favianna hung her show in February. It comes down this Friday, and we wanted to have an opportunity to have a second conversation, really in honor of International Women's History Month. Favianna and I have done this kind of conversation for many years before I moved here to Oakland, but we wanted to make sure that there was a full circle that came from the conversation we started about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago now, and to now wrap it up as we prepare to put up the next show. So just a little bit more about Omi Gallery is that it's clearly a container inside of a container, and I want to invite you all to become members or to think about membership and check out our website. So there's some cards here, I'll put them on the table outside by the snacks. And being a member here means that you would pay a monthly fee, just like you do at the YMCA, for instance, and this is your office. So it ranges from $30 a month to $415 a month, and there's also organizational membership, so you can talk to me about that. And then also I have a day pass for anyone who would like to come in and co-work. You can use this all year long, and feel free to pick that up for me. I'll just have them with me. And we can just continue this conversation, I don't know, over the next few months as artists continue to be part of the ongoing dialogue around social justice and really around being good business people, yeah? So with all of that said, again, thank you for joining us. I want to introduce to you my sister friend, artivist, printmaker, educator, badass migration enthusiast, Favianna Rodriguez.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm going to have a little story. I'm going to share a little story about how I got into art in the first place, and just talk about the theory of change that I propose and how that relates to women in particular, to sex, to our ideas around sexual freedom, and also just how dangerous it is when we don't address that, especially for women of color. So these are my parents, and my parents migrated to the United States in the late 60s, and in 1986, something happened that nobody believed, which is that Reagan signed the last immigration bill we have had since. In 1986, Reagan signed something called IRCA, which legalized 3 million migrants. Now that is the last time we had immigration reform. It's been almost a quarter of a century. Reagan, a Republican, one of the worst presidents of all time, and one of the worst, just completely in denial about AIDS, and he completely, gutted the National Endowment for the Arts. But I point this because immigration, which is a big theme that I approach in my work, is not a partisan issue, and I think often it gets framed as that. And I show Clinton here because in 1994, when I was a teenager, Clinton signed NAFTA, and it was a really defining moment for me because even though I was very young, I understood the rhetoric that was happening, which was essentially that the borders were now open for multinational corporations, and that same year they began to militarize the U.S.-Mexico border. That is the year they began to build the wall in El Paso and in San Diego. And so just this idea that somehow corporations could freely move and people couldn't. That year also here in 94, Governor Wilson introduced Proposition 187. It's the first time a governor proposed state-based immigrant legislation. And it set the tone, when we hear now about Arizona passing SB 1070, it all started here in California. It's important to note this because this, as an artist, these are the things that I grew up with, and I was really wondering, well, who is setting the tone for how we talk about migrants? And why is it that, you started seeing this in the late 90s, this really coded, racialized language around Mexican migrants in particular. And, my family's from Peru, but nobody comes and asks me, oh, are you from Peru? I'm going to treat you a little nicer than I treat the Mexicans. It was just a way, it was a way to begin a war on Latinos. And this was the 90s, y'all. Now we're in, 2014, and we're still living out these effects. Today there are over 1,100 deportations every single day. And I care about this. The other day I was in an interview and they said, well, why do you care about sexual freedom and food justice and immigration? And I said, well, because of the conditions I grew up with. My parents were migrants. I witnessed, and I continue to witness, tremendous suffering because of unjust laws. In my neighborhood, all we see is fast food industry, and that affects how my community eats. And second, and I'll talk about this in this piece, is that I grew up surrounded with whiteness. And not just whiteness in the sense of racially, but also whiteness in the sense of cultural whiteness that was imposed through the Catholic Church. In this portrait, it's a reflection of myself, and on the left I'm wearing white, because everywhere I would turn, whether it was going to the movies or reading magazines as a girl and as a teenager, and even as an adult, whiteness is the norm. It's cloaked, I think often, even though we see multiracial characters on TV, it's all cloaked within a lens of white supremacy. I recently watched the film Her, and I was just like baffled to see, there was, for 10 seconds, there was a black man dancing, and for another 10 seconds you saw an elderly Latino, and that's it. That's all you had. And I was thinking to myself, why is it that culturally all the messages we get create whiteness as the norm, and we're so used to it that we almost learn how to be invisible when it comes to culture. And here on the right, I'm wearing black, and as a way to say, my grandmother is Afro-Peruvian, and my parents never talked about blackness in our family. In fact, my grandmother worked in the home of a affluent Peruvian, more Spanish guy, and he got her pregnant. Even though he was married, he got her pregnant. She was the domestic worker in the house, and he never married her because he had a wife. But my grandmother, the only way she could interact with her kids was by being the domestic help in the house. And we didn't talk about that in my family, and I just thought it was interesting how it was almost like blackness didn't exist, even though it was very evident that my grandmother was of African heritage. We didn't talk about it. And I think in general, it's this negation of blackness, but also even in how we behave. I grew up in a Catholic culture, and I, completely messed with my head. But I remember during the quinceañeras, if you study the way the quinceañeras happen, young women wear these very elaborate white dresses. They have to be white usually, and then they go to the priest, and the priest says, you have to be a virgin, and you have to, wait till the holy sacrament of marriage for you to give up your virginity. It's a very kind of contractual way to talk about sex. But also, the messages that I was getting, I knew that my peers were having sex at 15, 14. And yet there was still this kind of desire to go along with the ritual. So early on, I think I started rebelling around all these ideas. And I want to show this image here in particular, the brain, because it really shows the theory of change through which I approach my work. So on the left, you have the space of action. And this is where you have things like laws. And so even though I was in a migrant family and we were, we grew up as a middle-class family, there was things that were happening on the law side that impacted how I grew up. And there are things even today. There are laws that are being passed around mass incarceration. There are laws about our right to abortion. There are laws about how it is that the benefits that we get from being married that affect us every single day. And those laws are being decided in Congress by overwhelmingly white men. I mean, there's never been a Latina in Congress ever, right? So just telling you, like these things are being decided on. And as an artist, I think often we're encouraged not to think about that space because that space is too political. But I think that here in the art space is where we think about ideas. And ideas is where you challenge the very systems that you grow up with, right? And an idea, for example, is if I were to make a comic book with a black superhero and she's fierce and she's trans and she has multiple partners and she lives in this fantasy world where she kills all these evildoers in the world. In the space of ideas is where we can really work with what's called the imaginary. And I'm very interested in this space as an artist because this is where we completely can rethink things like gender or sex or love. However, I think that the space of action we can't ignore. And especially as artists, we can't just live in the space of ideas. We have to go along the spectrum because these laws are directly going to impact our work. And specifically, when it comes to sexual freedom, the right wing has a very clear agenda on sex. I mean, they don't want you having sex with the same sex. They don't want you having sex outside marriage. They don't want sex taught in the high school. They don't want women to have abortions. They call, when you have anal sex, they call it sodomizing. Like, they have a very clear plan around how they influence their sexual values, their sexual ideas, and they turn them into action. And the progressive sector doesn't have that, and I think that that's something that I've very much found. This is why in my work, I'm going to talk about this in a sec, why I address these ideas in particular. This is a politician, of course. As we all learn in the organizing space, we can send them letters, we can go visit them, and we should. I very much think that we need to have conversations with our politicians, and of course they're influenced by money, that's a big influence, but they're also influenced by culture. And this is why it's important, at least for myself as an artist, and I think for the cultural space overall, the space of writers, actors, musicians, performers, to think about how we can influence the ideas. That's the action space, this is the ideas. Because ideas will be flowing into the politicians through different types of media. And if we can begin, this is how you shift narratives. When Ellen DeGeneres came out in 1997, that was like a big culture shifting moment. And even today, Ellen coming out wouldn't be the same because you don't have the same cultural conditions. But you need to create those conditions so that each time you create one, you have situations like today where men in sports can come out, right? And this is, in particular, the work that I aim to do is how do we put out counter ideas around sex, in particular, and relationships and love that can eventually turn into policy changes. I definitely think it's a 5-10 year plan. It's not something that's going to happen soon, but we should not estimate the power of culture. And I want to talk about Occupy in particular. You can't see this, but it says here, September 17th, Occupy Wall Street, bring tent. That was the image in Adbusters that gave birth to Occupy. And I think this is such a beautiful image of a ballerina on top of a bull. It really shows, you have the police here, and she's balancing in a very beautiful way. And this didn't say, let's take down capitalism. It didn't say, let's take down Wall Street and have our 10-point program. It didn't say that. It said, bring 10. And it was an invitation to participate, which I think is what made it very powerful. It was an invitation to intervene in the culture. If you look at news mentions of income inequality, this is what it was pre-Occupy. When Occupy begins, look at where it goes. When the forced removals happen, it begins to decrease. But by the fall of 2012, you have a new normal. And in fact, the World Economic Forum, since Occupy, their number one topic that they talk about as a threat to capitalism is income inequality. Which in their view, they think, how are we going to make all this money if there's so many poor folks, right? Capitalism can't survive unless there's a middle class. But this goes to show that a cultural movement created a new normal, a completely new normal. And even think about the gift that they gave us, which was the language of the 99%. I mean, even though that existed before, it's a study, it's a very old study, this whole 98-2% thing, but Occupy popularized it, and this, often Occupy would get criticized by the unions or by activists, and it would say, but what's their plan? Like, what are they demanding? And they said, well, we're demanding everything. Like, we need an entire shift of culture. And I think it was a really interesting tension between the policy space and the cultural space. It shouldn't have been a tension because the policy space should have recognized that you need to shift ideas before you can have action. But this really illustrates how it is that we can shift ideas. And I look at this specifically at what can artists do. Because often people think, well, you're just an artist, you're not getting people to come to a rally, or you're not getting them to vote for anything. What can we do? Well, what the power of art is that it can shift culture. Art has the ability to be highly controversial. I can get away with saying things as an artist that a nonprofit can't get away with, and I'll show you some of the stuff I could say. That is actually not that crazy. It's not, the things I'm going to show you are not even that crazy, but it's interesting how much of these things, the space that's working around sex and sexuality can't talk about. I'll talk about one campaign in particular. This is actually not related to sexual freedom, it's related to immigration. But I want to show it also as how we embrace the positive instead of just reacting to the negative, okay? So the anti-immigrants successfully normalized illegality, which means that they made it so that criminality is the lens through which we look at immigrants. And this is no mistake. Like, again, this started in the 90s. They did research groups. They knew the word illegal alien was a great term. And so they began to kind of, little by little, state by state, inject this whole way of thinking that was around illegality. And here we are, more than 10 years later, and successfully there's been a lot of policy that's followed that. Now, often in the movement, we say we're not illegal. Don't deport us. No deportations, or it's always in the no. And if you think about it, we're actually, it's like if the right-wingers say, this is what I'm going to call you, then we're going to say, no, don't call me that. Like, we're here in their space. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to stop and think, well, we can't just always play in their space, because then what are we proposing? Like, what is our idea for being a visionary? And this is, I studied the Black is Beautiful campaign, and the Black is Beautiful movement began because black activists thought to themselves, we're fighting for our civil rights, we're fighting against segregation, but there's a war in our mind, in our imagination, that we're not fighting. And that is the war that society tells us we're ugly. So how do we turn that around as we say we're beautiful? And that's where Migration is Beautiful was born, is really thinking through, my mother, for example. I mean, my mother came from Peru on a very long journey. She was 17 years old, and she left everything and didn't return for almost 20 years. And the story, there's people who leave. Imagine what it would be like for you to one day have to leave because your economic conditions are so harsh, and you have to leave your children and your family, and you may never see them again. You're going to get on a train, and you're going to be on that train for 57 days, cross through a desert that you will most likely die in. These are not easy decisions. And actually, whoever makes those decisions is extremely courageous. And yet, when we look at the migrant, we somehow think they magically arrived at the border, and we don't understand that the amount of the epic journey that they have to make, we don't even respect it. And the way that the migrant is viewed is not like, wow, look at this, like Ulysses and the Iliad, right? And the Odyssey. We don't say, look at this epic journey this human did in order to live, in order to survive. It's the counter. And so I wanted to show how it is that we can actually celebrate and show the beauty of these stories. These are migration stories. You know, migration, we've been migrating since the beginning of time. I mean, our ancestors migrated from Africa. So movement is nothing foreign to us, yet the idea that it's somehow a criminal act is a very contemporary idea, but it's a constructed idea. This is one of my street art pieces during the Democratic National Convention. I work with a lot of children and youth because children are facing trauma because their parents are deported. Every single day there's 15 children put into foster care because their parents are deported. And you know what those kids are going to grow up with, the issues they're going to grow up with being in foster care? And what have their parents done? They're migrants. I mean, they've come precisely for their kids, and I wanted to do the butterfly so that the children have something also positive to think about, you know, a positive lens to understand their parents' journey. In Philadelphia, these women took the butterfly and they covered an ICE building. This is an Immigration Customs Enforcement building. And I loved how they just took a very dangerous place and covered it with art and made it like as a way to say, we're not afraid of you. Like we can challenge you. Moving into the space of patriarchy, it's a little hard to read. This is cutting off some of my words, but it says fight patriarchy. And early on, of course, I began to understand that the messages I was getting about how I looked or how much I weighed or even the fact that I was a woman of color were messages that were very carefully crafted by an industry run by men. And the more I began to get politically educated, you know, I mean, you just have to look at U.S. Congress to understand that men are still designing laws that affect women. And in the world, women overwhelmingly live in poverty still. We continue to be the poorest. We're the most exploited. Sex trafficking is the largest grossing industry in the world. And so to think that somehow that we're in this space of equality is a lie. It just does. It's not. The way that decisions are made doesn't consider women's voices at all. And so in my work, I try to expose that, and I especially do it through the lens of being a woman of color. So to not just understand gender, but to also understand the way that racism impacts that. And now moving into what happened. I'll share a personal story, which was that as a young person, I was very male identified, which I was just like really a rough girl. If I liked a boy or a girl, I would totally go for it. I was very, very outspoken and firm in my desires, and always was willing to kind of pursue things. And I think it was because my mom was a very strong woman. But early on, I remember just not learning about my body and not learning about things like safe sex. My parents didn't talk to me about safe sex. And I don't think it's because they didn't want to, I just think they didn't have the tools or the language. And also culturally, because we were, my parents were very Catholic, there was just not, those conversations didn't happen. And even though sometimes mysteriously condoms would appear in my bedroom, no one talked to me about pleasure, no one taught me how to negotiate what I wanted, or even how to understand what I liked or I didn't like. When I got into my first long-term relationship, which lasted about 7 years, I read this book called The Ethical Slut. And when I read that book, I was like, wow, this is, I began to have a language for things that I had been feeling, which was The Ethical Slut is a book that talks about open relationships, but it also talks about how you understand what you like and how you can learn how to assess, make a list, what turns you on, how do you negotiate the things that you like, how do you ask for them, how do you shed guilt, right? How do you address things like jealousy? In my 7-year relationship, I began exploring open relationships 4 years in, and that was a really game-changing moment for me. And since then, that was in 2004, and since then I've been on a journey to really understand who I am as a woman and my desires. This is one of my art pieces that I did, Sex Positivity, Liberate Your Sexuality. And again, it's because I grew up in a sex-negative culture. Even in high school, I went to high school here in the East Bay. the language that I would get around how to have sex was just extremely health-centered. And now in hindsight, you know, I mean, me and all the other women in my class were having sex. And that is happening today. I think young girls are having sex at even a younger age. So to not have a conversation with them about pleasure, or even helping them understand what they like and what they don't like, it is detrimental. If you look at Latinas have the highest teenage pregnancy rate. Okay, so our community is like in denial because young women in our community are getting pregnant. Precisely, one of the big reasons is because the language is not there. We don't, culturally, the education is not happening in the way that it should. And we're not having the tools or the agency to be able to advocate for ourselves. And it's, you know, the fact that we are still continue to be number one, I think is a big sign that it's just, you know, it's not something that we can sustain. This piece I did in 2012, you know, in 2012, in 2013, excuse me, 2012 is when you began to see the anti-abortion laws happening in different states. In 2013, there was over 400 anti-abortion laws introduced and about 200 of them passed. It was a turning point for me as an artist because it says there, I'm a slut, by the way. It cut off the best part. It says, I'm a slut, I vote, so does everyone else I sleep with, and you're about to be more fucked than I am. And this was, I have to say, this was a turning point for me to make this piece. And it was a turning point for me because it was the moment that I articulated ideas that I already had into my art. And it made me realize that I had been living my own stigma. Even though I had engaged in open relationships, I was very on the DL about it, and I never identified as a slut. In fact, I was slut-shamed throughout high school, so I was carrying some of those issues. But when I began to think about it, I was like, well, you know, there are about 120 ways to call a woman a slut, and there are about 20 equivalents to call a male a slut. But I was really thinking, you know, is a slut like, let's just really think about what it is and who decides who a slut is. And I had been observing the slut walks, but I wanted to have something that was more centered from a women of color's perspective, and that also tied things to policy, and that really actively talked about the fact that I was having sex, and having sex in a really slutty way, and I, you know, just putting these ideas out there. And I couldn't believe the reception to this stuff. I couldn't believe just how many, up there it says pussy power, by the way. I couldn't believe how many people were sharing it, talking about it, saying, I want to be a slut too, you know, can we have, like, you know, let's have a slut unity thing. And it made me realize first that the language that we have to organize around the issues of reproductive justice, sexual freedom, even young women being able to advocate for themselves is totally outdated. And, you know, Planned Parenthood, Choice USA, these are like the mega organizations dealing with protecting our right to abortion. Now, their language is so boring. It's just like, you know, it's not even engaging. And it's so, you know how I talked about, it's very much like, no.